Hello there, and welcome to my last Sprout guide, and the one that's arguably the most relevant for the largest amount of players, damage dealers. The DPS role is wide and varied, covering the caster, ranged physical, and melee jobs in the game. I think I won't cause complaints in the comments this time if I say that DPS is generally considered the most straightforward job to play, and has the least amount of difficulty attached to it, primarily because you only have one job, and that is to deal as much damage as you can. DPS players have the luxury of focusing on their rotations, having to pay very little attention to other people around them unless they are red mage or a summoner that needs to occasionally help with rezzing dead players. In this video, I shall attempt to guide Sprouts and players new to the DPS jobs towards the path of being a big damage dealer. I won't differentiate between the melee, range, and caster jobs too much, otherwise I'll have another 18-minute long video on my hands. So we'll focus on the key principles that every DPS job requires you to learn and master, and the things that may seem really obvious to veteran players, but that I had to have spelled out for me when I was new to the game. As always, we start with the role of the DPS player, and the role is really fucking simple. Deal max damage, don't die, mitigate when needed, and we'll break those down into the order in which you should learn them in a moment. When you play a DPS job, it's rare that other players will notice your rotation or whether you're playing your job optimally outside of Savage Plus content. If your healer sucks, you'll know, because you'll be dead. If your tank isn't playing their job correctly, you'll know, because you'll be dead. The only way to know if DPS players are doing their jobs is the rate at which things die, or in the case of harder content, whether DPS checks are being met. This means as a DPS player, you're only accountable for your individual performance, and in an ideal world, every DPS player would care about their damage output and do their very best to play their jobs as close as possible to what is ideal, if just out of the respect for their fellow party members. But if you don't care about the big numbers and how much damage you're doing, and learning a complex rotation is too much for you, and you just want to press whatever 3 buttons you like the best, well, then you can just play Dancer and still do your job relatively well. For real though, if you're ever planning to play the harder raid content in the game, you need to learn to use all the tools you have at your disposal. Now, the number one thing that is critical as a DPS player is don't die. You might have expected me to talk about rotation or openness first, but the single most important thing that DPS players get memed on a lot for is do not die. Avoid death at all costs. But my melee phase, but my ley lines, but my phoenix, but my rotation, but my positionals. No, do not fucking die. Death is the single biggest DPS loss in this game, and even if you have the fastest rezzers in the east as your healers, you'll get weakness, which reduces your damage by 25% for like 90 seconds or something. If somehow you die again, you'll get Brink of Death, reducing your damage by a total of 50% for another significant period of time. That is a massive DPS loss, and at the Savage Plus tier, this can be the difference between meeting a DPS check or wiping. Dodging AoEs and resolving mechanics properly is 9 out of 10 times more important than anything else. A big part of learning how to play DPS is judging how much time you can stay in melee range for before getting smacked by an AoE, what the ideal ways are to dodge mechanics, and generally how you keep dealing as much damage as possible while staying alive. Now that we've covered death and beyond, we can now focus on the real parts of the gameplay. Let's start with your rotation. Each job has an optimal rotation of abilities. Rotation is just the order in which you push your buttons in to deal the most damage that you can. Generally speaking, most jobs have a single target rotation and an AoE rotation, and most of the time you only want to use your AoE rotation on groups of 3 enemies or more. To learn your rotation, you'll have to read. Not just your tooltips, but actual documents. Tooltips are notoriously bad in Final Fantasy, often not properly explaining how abilities work, or not really notifying you if a skill has changed due to unlocking a trait as you're leveling. Most rotations will change as you level, so it's worth paying attention to the skills and traits you unlock over time. The best places to learn the standard rotations are in guides made by the theory crafters in the community, which you can find over at the Balance Discord server. Of course, you can just read the skills and do the math yourself, but the fastest way to learn is to check what experienced players recommend and testing that out first. Some jobs have rather convoluted rotations that require a good bit of muscle memory and experience to master, so that's generally why I recommend looking up what your optimal rotation would be and starting from there. Mastering your rotation requires practice, even more so if you're playing a job with a significant amount of RNG involved. I highly recommend hitting some training dummies to get good. Oh, and don't forget, if your job has a damage over time ability, it's always a priority to make sure that thing is ticking for as long as possible throughout the fight. Depending on your job, your rotation will also teach you a sense of timing. Most rotations are on timed windows. For example, Summoner is on a roughly 2-minute rotation based on its different trances and phases. These timings are different for each job, normally based on buffs and other big abilities becoming available. Now to end this section, never forget that the key to high DPS is to always be casting. This means your global cooldown should be continuously rolling for those 2.5 seconds, regardless of your job. Okay, now that we've covered rotations, let's talk about openers. Once you reach around level 60 or 70, you can start learning your job's openers, but keep in mind that for most jobs you need to be level 80 to have access to all the necessary skills. An opener is a part of your rotation that you normally use at the start of a fight and then every few minutes when all the involved abilities are available to you again. Your opener is normally your highest possible damage squeezed into a 30 to 40 second long sequence to deal as much damage as you can at the beginning of a fight. It is worth noting that every opener in the game requires you to learn how to weave abilities, so if that's a concept still unfamiliar to you, I'll link a few guides below. Openers normally assume that everyone in your party is using their raid-wide damage buffs at the beginning, allowing everyone to deal maximum damage, so make sure that you're also using your damage buffs right as your opener demands. You want to be using your opener on every boss fight that you can, and in dungeons for instance, you normally save the big spells in between boss fights so you can use them for your opener. Openers are similar to your rotation in the sense that you have to learn how to use them separately from the rotation itself, and then once you've mastered them, you combine them. Most DPS jobs operate in a very simple cycle of opener, rotation, and so forth. It is worth noting that all jobs have a standard opener, but for some savage fights, you'll have an alternative opener that's recommended. It's worth learning your standard rotation and an opener first, and once you're comfortable with them and you reach the savage tier, you can start researching how your job ideally approaches the fight, and if there's different openers and rotations for you to learn for the fight in particular. And with those fundamental DPS concepts covered, let's talk about melee DPS tips and then we'll move into ranged and caster tips. As melee DPS, you have to deal with something called Positionals, which applies to certain abilities that'll do more damage if you're hitting it from behind or if you're attacking from the side. It's generally recommended that you learn the order of your skills first before meeting the positional requirements every time. You do have True North to help you out as it'll enable you to skip the positional requirements and still deal the full amount of damage. But as you get comfortable with your opener and your rotation, you need to start moving around the boss to land those positional abilities for maximum damage. This is also why your relationship with your tank is important. The less the tank moves the boss around, the easier it'll be for you to move around the boss to hit from all the right angles. There's an interesting video where Ilya did some testing on dummies to check how much damage you lose if you're always ignoring the positional requirement for your jobs. I recommend you watch it and it'll be in the description below. But the takeaway is that if you're a monk or a ninja, you'll suffer the most from missed positionals, while samurais and dragoons can get away with it most of the time with less punishment. The general consensus is that always be casting results in more damage. So if you have to choose between running and hitting one positional and delaying your global cooldown, or staying in one spot and hitting 2 global cooldowns instead, you want to hit 2 of them instead. The last piece of advice I have for melee DPS players is that you want to use Sprint. Sprint is great for getting out of AoEs, and if you have to stay inside an AoE to get that last damage ability off, Sprint can help you get out before you die. It's a very underrated skill, and I recommend you use it more. For the ranged DPS players and for casters, always be casting is equally important. On top of this, casters will want to learn how to slidecast. Slidecasting is a mechanic where you can move before your cast bar has reached the end of it and the spell will still go through. This is a result of Final Fantasy having lag compensation built into the system, so the amount of leeway you have in slidecasting depends on 2 things, the length of the cast and your ping. Now on screen, you'll see a few examples of me slidecasting. Personally, I play on roughly 60 millisecond ping, so this is what works for me. This definitely requires practice, but it'll allow you to keep your always be casting mantra up while dodging AoEs and moving into specific locations in the arena. It's also worth learning where the best places are in a boss fight that'll allow you to cast the most and move the least. Black mages are notorious for never wanting to move, but as long as you keep rule number 1 in mind, which is to avoid death at all costs, and you get close enough for healing, you should be fine. Ranged DPS players have it the easiest. Your main challenge is having your hotbars and keybinds set up in a way where you can still move freely while mashing your rotation, since you don't have any cast times or any positional abilities. You focus on running and gunning to the right location while perfecting your rotation. Now we have 2 more topics to cover. The first one is DPS Limit Break 3, or Limit Break in general. DPS Limit Break is the most commonly used limit break. Few things to keep in mind. LB3 for melee DPS is the single highest potency skill in the game, coming in at 9000 potency as a single target spell. Limit Break 3 for ranged and casters can hit multiple enemies, but comes down to 6150 potency per target hit. Limit Break for ranged DPS players is a line AoE, and for casters is a big circle AoE. Of course, melee is single target. Now you know me want to prefer the melee DPS LB3 for boss fights, because it's quite rare that you have to hit more than one target in a boss fight, but if there are multiple targets to hit, I prefer the caster AoE because it's much easier to target. Some fights will only bring you up to Limit Break 1 or 2 before they finish, especially in lower level content. Now if the boss reaches around 15% health or lower, just go ahead and use it. The animation lock is still the same as it was for tanks and for healers, so make sure you only use it when you have around 5 to 6 seconds of no mechanics ahead of you. The last thing to know about Limit Break is that it's not affected by any damage buffs, so use it instead of your normal rotation, and not while all the damage buffs are up. And that covers most of what I had to say about Limit Break. And hey guys, post-production Al here, realizing that I am actually an idiot and I forgot to record the mitigation part of the video. You generally want to mitigate incoming raid-wide damage, especially during extreme content and above. Ranged physical DPS players have a universal 10% incoming damage reduction. If there is more than one ranged physical DPS player, you'll want them to agree on who mitigates what abilities, as their mitigations do not stack. Melee DPS players have Feint, which reduces a target's physical damage dealt, and casters have Addle, which reduces the target's magical damage dealt. For extreme fights and above, it is worth checking what damage is what type, so you can mitigate effectively. In Savage content, DPS mitigation is absolutely critical, as several fights have mitigation checks. Generally speaking, in low-level content, just mitigate when raid-wide is coming. It's better to try than to waste it. Now we're moving into the last topic, and this is something more opinion-based, and not all of you might agree with this, but let me talk about improving as a DPS player. One of the fundamental problems the game has, and this is something that has always annoyed me to a high degree, is that you cannot tell how well you're performing as a DPS player. Tanks can look at enmity and they see how well they're holding aggro, they can look at tank mechanics and tank swaps, and if they're mitigating well, they'll know. A healer can look at the party list and make sure nobody dies, and then deal damage on top of that. As a DPS player, you can't really measure your success as easily. Given that Final Fantasy XIV does not provide any real DPS metrics for you to look at, you can't even tell how well you're performing in relation to the other DPS players in your party. This has always really pissed me off, given that every extreme, every savage, and every ultimate fight has a bunch of DPS checks built in. That means if your party doesn't deal enough damage, you automatically die. Given that as a DPS player it is your responsibility to kill things and to make sure that those DPS checks are met, you'll want to know how much damage you're dealing and how much damage you're lacking. Now, I can't tell you to violate certain terms of service and use potentially rule-breaking third-party software that will enable you to measure your damage output, but if you are serious about the endgame raiding content and you want to play your DPS role to its full capability, this is basically a must-have, as it will allow you to troubleshoot your opener and your rotation. Should you be willing to engage in Square Enix's policies of don't ask, don't tell? You can even go as far as using said software and uploading your logs to a special website, and then 1. Compare damage performance to other players in the same job category in the same fight. Very cool. And 2. You can upload that log to a website like FFXIV Analysis, which will then point out your fundamental flaws in your rotation, your uptime, and execution. Now, if a Square Enix admin holds a gun to your head and pulls you into the GM jail, and they ask you, where did you learn how to parse? Where did you hear about these illegal softwares? You tell them it wasn't my fault. It was Desperius's fault for leading you down this road, okay? But for real though, using ACT shouldn't get you in trouble unless you're shitting on other players and their in-game performance or lack thereof. It's best used in helping you improve your own gameplay or to troubleshoot a static's DPS problems in high-end content. If you are a PS4 player, well, sorry. Okay, I think that covers all of the basics I have that a new player should learn in improving their gameplay as a DPS player. If you master the basics of avoiding death, of mastering your opener and your rotation, of limit breaking at the right time, of getting good at, self-evaluating and improving accordingly, you'll become a high DPS player very, very quickly. Good DPS players are always in demand and they can be very difficult to find. And if you follow these basics and you get the rotation and everything else right, you'll be in demand very soon. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. This concludes my Sprout guide, having covered all of the basic roles. I have lots of other content planned. There's been quite a bit of demand for my power leveling guides for crafting and for gathering, which I'll be making soon as well. And with Endwalker approaching release and us having now a couple of months of downtime, I have a lot of content planned. As always, thank you so much for watching. You can join my Discord server with a link down below if you want to chat to me outside of the game. You can follow me at twitch.tv/alzahart, where I'm streaming my Final Fantasy adventures on a regular basis now. And we have, emotes and shit there, so feel free to drop by. It's always good fun. That's all I got, and see you guys next week. If you have any content requests, do let me know. I'm always happy to chat.